The name Josiah Henson echoes through history, a figure often remembered as the gentle, long-suffering Uncle Tom, a symbol of quiet endurance. But what if the truth of his life, the real man behind the legend, was far more complex, shadowed by choices so agonizing they would haunt a soul for eternity? What if the story we know is merely a carefully constructed facade, concealing a past steeped in moral terror and a secret burden that few could ever comprehend? The true narrative of Josiah Henson is not one of simple virtue, but of a man trapped in an inferno of impossible decisions, a man who walked a tightrope between survival and betrayal, carrying a secret that could shatter the very image history has painted of him. Before we continue with the story of Josiah Henson, a tale woven from the threads of history and the chilling whispers of what might have been, please take a moment to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next descent into the shadows of the past. And tell us in the comments below, from what state or city are you listening to this unsettling chapter of American history? Your engagement helps us unearth more forgotten truths. The year 1789 dawned with a fragile promise of new beginnings for some, but for others, it merely marked the continuation of an inherited nightmare. In Charles County, Maryland, on the sprawling, tobacco-choked lands of Francis Newman, a child named Josiah was born into bondage. His earliest memories were not of a mother's gentle lullaby, but of the raw, guttural screams that tore through the humid air, the metallic tang of blood, and the acrid smell of fear. He was barely old enough to walk when his father, a man of formidable strength and spirit, had his ear brutally severed for daring to defend his wife from a white overseer's assault. The image of his father, bleeding and broken, yet defiant, was seared into Josiah's young mind, a silent testament to the brutal realities of their existence. Soon after, his father was sold south, vanishing into the abyss of the cotton fields, leaving behind a void that no child should ever know. His mother, a woman named Millie, carried the weight of this trauma like a shroud. Her spirit, once vibrant, dimmed with each passing year, her eyes holding a perpetual sorrow that Josiah learned to recognize as the silent language of their people. She taught him the rhythms of the earth, the secrets of the forest, and the quiet dignity of survival, but also the ever-present danger that lurked beneath the surface of every seemingly calm day. The Newman plantation was a microcosm of the South, a place where human lives were currency, where the crack of the whip was as common as the chirping of crickets, and where the sun beat down relentlessly on fields of tobacco and corn, watered by the sweat and tears of enslaved men and women. As Josiah grew, his physical prowess became undeniable. Tall, powerfully built, with an intelligence that shone in his eyes, he quickly distinguished himself. When Francis Newman's son-in-law, Isaac Riley, inherited a portion of the estate, Josiah, still a young man, was transferred to his service. Riley, a man of fluctuating fortunes and a temperament as unpredictable as the Maryland weather, soon recognized Josiah's capabilities. Unlike many of his peers, Josiah possessed a keen mind for management, an innate understanding of agriculture, and a surprising aptitude for literacy, secretly taught to him by a kind-hearted white boy on a neighboring farm. These skills, rare and valuable among the enslaved, set him apart. It was this unique combination of strength, intelligence, and perceived loyalty that led to his ascent. Riley, facing mounting debts and a growing disinterest in the day-to-day grind of plantation management, made a decision that would forever alter Josiah's destiny and cast a long, dark shadow over his soul. He appointed Josiah as his overseer, or superintendent, as Riley preferred to call it, over the other enslaved people. The promotion was a double-edged sword, a poisoned chalice offered with a deceptive smile. On one hand, it granted Josiah privileges unimaginable to others: better food, slightly better clothing, a small cabin for his growing family, his beloved wife, Charlotte, and their children. It meant a reprieve from the back-breaking labor in the fields, a chance to protect his own from the worst cruelties. But on the other hand, it thrust him into an impossible position, a moral quagmire from which there seemed no escape. He was now the intermediary between the master's capricious will and the suffering of his own people. He was given the whip, not to be used on himself, but on those he called kin, those who shared his bondage, his heritage, his silent prayers for freedom. The psychological complexity of this role was a torment that gnawed at his very core. He was an enslaved man, yet he held power over other enslaved men and women. He was expected to enforce the master's rules, to drive production, to mete out punishments, to maintain order. The other enslaved people looked at him with a mixture of awe, resentment, and fear. Some saw him as a protector, a buffer against Riley's worst impulses. Others saw him as a collaborator, a tool of their oppression, a man who had traded his soul for a few scraps of comfort. Josiah walked a tightrope every single day. He learned to navigate the treacherous currents of plantation politics, to anticipate Riley's moods, to soften the blows where he could, to feign harshness when necessary. He developed a chillingly effective strategy. He would often administer punishments himself, but with a calculated restraint, ensuring the blows were painful enough to satisfy Riley's demands for discipline, yet never so severe as to cause permanent injury or death. He became a master of the performance, a silent actor in a brutal play, his face a mask of stern authority, his heart a battlefield of conflicting loyalties. The air on the Riley plantation was thick with the scent of tobacco leaves curing in the barns, the earthy smell of freshly turned soil, and the ever-present subtle odor of fear. The sounds were a constant symphony of oppression, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle, the rhythmic thud of hoes in the fields, and the occasional sharp crack of a whip, sometimes wielded by Riley himself, sometimes by Josiah. Every sunrise brought with it the dread of the unknown. Every sunset, the exhaustion of another day survived. Josiah's cabin, though slightly larger, felt no less a cage. The whispers of his children at night, the soft rustle of Charlotte beside him, were his only solace and his greatest vulnerability. He knew with a chilling certainty that his position, his family's fragile safety, depended entirely on his ability to maintain this impossible charade. The moral tension was a constant suffocating presence, a silent scream trapped within his chest, waiting for the moment it would inevitably burst forth. The humid Maryland summer of 1818 brought with it a suffocating stillness, a prelude to the storm that would forever scar Josiah's conscience. The tobacco crop had been meager, and Riley's debts, always a looming shadow, had grown into a monstrous, insatiable beast. The air on the plantation was thick with unspoken anxieties, the enslaved people moving with a heightened sense of dread, knowing that financial hardship for the master often meant brutal consequences for them. Whispers of sales, of families being torn apart, snaked through the cabins like venomous serpents. It was during this tense period that a young man named Daniel, known for his fiery spirit and his quiet defiance, made a desperate move. Daniel had a wife, Esther, and a newborn son, Jacob, and the fear of their separation had driven him to the brink. One moonless night, Daniel, along with two other young men, Caleb and Samuel, attempted to flee. Their plan, hastily conceived and poorly executed, was doomed from the start. They were apprehended by a group of slave catchers hired by a neighboring planter, their escape thwarted before they had even crossed the county line. The news reached the Riley plantation like a thunderclap. Riley, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and financial panic, immediately summoned Josiah. "Henson!" he roared, his voice echoing through the main house. "They caught Daniel and his accomplices. They're being held at the Miller farm. Go! Bring them back! And make an example of them! Let every soul on this plantation understand the cost of defiance." Josiah felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He knew Daniel, a proud, stubborn young man who had often challenged Josiah's authority, questioning his compromises. He knew Esther, Daniel's wife, a quiet, devout woman whose eyes now held a terror that mirrored Millie's. And he knew Jacob, a tiny, innocent bundle whose future now hung by a thread. Riley handed Josiah a heavy, braided leather whip, its thongs stiff and new. "Make sure they remember this, Henson. Make sure everyone remembers." Josiah's hands trembled as he took the whip. The weight of it felt like 1,000 sins. He rode to the Miller farm, the silence of the journey punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves and the frantic pounding of his own heart. His mind raced, a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He could refuse, but what then? Riley's wrath would be swift and merciless, not just for him, but for Charlotte and their children. He could administer a token punishment, but Riley would see through it, and the consequences would be dire. He could follow orders, but at what cost to his soul? When he arrived, Daniel, Caleb, and Samuel were already bound, their faces bruised and swollen, their eyes defiant yet filled with a desperate plea. Esther stood nearby, clutching baby Jacob, her silent sobs tearing at Josiah's heart. The other enslaved people from the Miller farm watched, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Josiah looked at Daniel, their eyes locking. In Daniel's gaze, Josiah saw not just fear, but a flicker of accusation, a question. "Are you truly one of us, Henson? Or are you merely another of his tools?" Josiah's breath hitched. He thought of Charlotte, her gentle smile, the warmth of her hand in his. He thought of his children, their laughter, their innocent trust. He thought of his father, his ear severed, his spirit broken. He thought of his mother, her silent sorrow. He thought of the fragile, precarious safety he had carved out for his family, a safety that could be shattered in an instant. He raised the whip. The air crackled with tension. Esther let out a small, choked cry. Josiah's arm, usually so steady, felt heavy, leaden. He brought the whip down, not with the full force Riley expected, but with a controlled, agonizing precision. The first blow landed on Daniel's back, a sharp, stinging crack that elicited a gasp, but not a scream. Josiah continued, each stroke a calculated torment, designed to inflict pain without permanent damage, to leave welts that would heal, but scars that would serve as a warning. He counted the blows, his mind a blur, his ears ringing with the sound of the whip and the silent screams of his own conscience. He saw the other enslaved people flinch with each strike, their eyes wide with terror. He saw Esther bury her face in Jacob's blanket. He saw Daniel's body convulse, but his eyes, though filled with pain, still held that flicker of defiance, that silent question. When it was over, Josiah's hands were shaking uncontrollably. The whip felt like a living thing, pulsing with the pain it had inflicted. He turned to the other two, Caleb and Samuel, and repeated the grim ritual, his movements mechanical, his soul recoiling with every swing. He left them bleeding but alive, their spirits wounded but not broken. He left Esther weeping, her hope extinguished. He left the Miller farm with the taste of ash in his mouth, the stench of fear clinging to his clothes, and the chilling knowledge that he had just sacrificed a piece of his soul to protect his own. The journey back to the Riley plantation was a blur. The whip, now stained with the blood of his brethren, lay coiled beside him, a grotesque symbol of his compromise. He had done what was necessary, he told himself, over and over again, a desperate mantra against the rising tide of guilt. He had protected his family. He had ensured their survival, for now. But at what cost? The image of Daniel's eyes, those questioning, accusing eyes, would forever be etched into his memory, a silent condemnation that no amount of self-justification could erase. The dark event had passed, but its shadow would stretch long and cold over the remainder of Josiah Henson's life. The incident with Daniel, Caleb, and Samuel became a festering wound in Josiah's soul, a constant, throbbing ache beneath the surface of his carefully constructed composure. The memory of the whip in his hand, the sound of its crack, the sight of Daniel's flinching back replayed in his mind with agonizing clarity, especially in the quiet, suffocating darkness of night. He would often wake in a cold sweat, the phantom weight of the whip still in his grasp, the silent accusations of those he had punished echoing in his ears. He tried to rationalize it, to bury it beneath layers of necessity and self-preservation, but the guilt was a persistent, insidious poison, slowly eroding his sense of self. His relationships with the other enslaved people shifted subtly, irrevocably. Some, like old Martha, a woman who had seen generations come and go, would avert their gaze when he approached, their silence a louder condemnation than any spoken word. Others, particularly the younger men, would eye him with a mixture of resentment and grudging respect, understanding the impossible bind he was in, yet unable to forgive the choices he had made. He overheard whispers, fragments of conversations that died abruptly when he drew near. "He's the master's man. He'd whip his own mother if Riley told him to." These words, though unspoken to his face, pierced him deeper than any lash. He felt a profound, chilling isolation, a chasm opening between him and the community he was ostensibly a part of. He was an outsider, even among his own. Yet, paradoxically, Riley's trust in Josiah deepened. The master saw the incident as proof of Josiah's loyalty, his effectiveness, his willingness to do what was necessary. "Henson," Riley would often say, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes, "you understand what it takes to keep order. You're a valuable man, Henson. A truly valuable man." This praise, meant to be a reward, felt like another turn of the screw, tightening the chains of his moral compromise. Riley began to rely on him more heavily, entrusting him with greater responsibilities, managing the crops, overseeing the livestock, even handling small sums of money in the local market. Josiah became indispensable, a fact that both terrified and empowered him. The more indispensable he became, the more he felt trapped, his golden cage growing ever more ornate, yet no less confining. His only solace, his anchor in the turbulent sea of his existence, was his family. Charlotte, his steadfast wife, possessed a quiet strength that both grounded and shamed him. She saw the torment in his eyes, the lines of worry etched around his mouth, and though she never questioned his actions directly, her silent understanding was a constant reminder of the sacrifices he made for them. Their children, Tom, Peter, Isaac, Rebecca, Mary, and Sarah, were his world. Their innocent faces, their laughter, their small hands reaching for his, were the fuel that kept him going, the justification for every agonizing choice. He would watch them sleep, their chests rising and falling in peaceful rhythm, and a fierce, protective love would surge through him, momentarily eclipsing the guilt. He would do anything, to keep them safe, to spare them the horrors he had endured. This fierce love, however, also became his greatest weakness, the lever Riley unknowingly used to control him. The economics of slavery in Maryland during this period were a brutal dance of profit and loss. Tobacco, once the king crop, was slowly exhausting the soil, and prices were volatile. Planters like Riley, who lacked the foresight or the capital to diversify, found themselves increasingly vulnerable. Land values fluctuated, and the constant threat of debt loomed large. For the enslaved, this meant one thing: they themselves were the most valuable asset, the most liquid form of capital. A man, a woman, a child. Each represented a sum of money that could be used to pay off a debt, to buy more land, or simply to keep the master afloat. The fear of being sold south to the brutal cotton and sugar plantations of Alabama, Mississippi, or Louisiana was a constant, chilling specter, a fate worse than death for many, as it meant almost certain separation from family and a life of even more extreme hardship. Josiah understood this grim reality better than anyone. He saw the ledgers, he heard Riley's anxious conversations with creditors, he witnessed the desperate measures other planters took. He knew, with a cold certainty, that their fragile existence on the Riley plantation was always one bad harvest, one failed speculation, one mounting debt away from utter collapse. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror of Josiah's impossible choice intensifies. The weight of his decisions, the silent screams of his conscience, are about to be tested in ways he could never have imagined. If you're finding yourself drawn into this dark corner of history, please like this video, share it with someone who appreciates a truly unsettling tale, and leave a comment with your theories on the moral tightrope Josiah is walking. Your engagement fuels our journey into the past. The year 1825 brought with it a shift in the Maryland air, not just in temperature, but in the very fabric of the Riley plantation's existence. Riley's financial woes, once a persistent hum, had escalated into a deafening roar. His land, depleted by years of tobacco cultivation, yielded less and less. His investments, always speculative, had soured. The creditors, once patient, were now circling like vultures. Josiah, privy to Riley's increasingly desperate conversations and the grim figures in his ledgers, felt the tightening noose of impending disaster. He knew with a chilling certainty that a major change was imminent. One sweltering afternoon, Riley summoned Josiah to the main house. The master's face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot, but there was a forced cheerfulness in his voice that immediately put Josiah on edge. "Henson," Riley began, gesturing for Josiah to stand before his desk. "I have made a decision, a grand decision, one that will benefit us all. Maryland, my friend, is no longer the land of opportunity it once was. The soil is tired, the markets are fickle. But Kentucky, Kentucky, a land of fertile ground, of new beginnings, of prosperity." Josiah listened, his heart sinking with each word. He knew the rhetoric. New beginnings for the master often meant renewed suffering for the enslaved. Riley went on to explain his plan. He would move his entire property, his enslaved people, his remaining livestock, and what little equipment he could salvage, to a new farm in Kentucky, near the town of Daviess County. He painted a vivid picture of a promised land, where the work would be lighter, the food more plentiful, and families would remain intact. "No more sales, Henson," Riley declared, his voice booming with false sincerity. "We will build a new life together, a community, a family in Kentucky." Then came the pronouncement that both elevated Josiah and plunged him into a deeper abyss of moral torment. "And you, Henson," Riley said, his eyes gleaming with what Josiah now recognized as manipulative trust, "you will lead them. You are my most trusted man, my superintendent. You will take the entire company, men, women, children, livestock, on the journey. You will guide them safely to Kentucky. I will follow later, once I have settled my affairs here. You will be in charge, Henson. The fate of all of them rests in your capable hands." Josiah's mind reeled. To be entrusted with such a responsibility, to lead his people to what was promised as a better life, was an honor. But the forced cheerfulness in Riley's voice, the too eager promises, grated against Josiah's finely honed instincts for deception. He had seen too many promises broken, too many hopes dashed. That night, unable to sleep, Josiah paced the small confines of his cabin. The weight of the impending journey, the lives entrusted to him, pressed down on him. He thought of Charlotte, her quiet optimism, her hope for a better future for their children. He thought of the other enslaved people, their faces alight with a fragile hope, clinging to Riley's words. He had to know the truth. His opportunity came a few days later. Riley, in his haste to prepare for his own departure, had left his desk in disarray. A stack of papers, usually meticulously guarded, lay exposed. Josiah, with his secretly acquired literacy, felt an irresistible pull. His heart pounded against his ribs as he slipped into the main house under the cover of twilight, his movements as silent as a shadow. His eyes scanned the documents. Bills of sale, promissory notes, letters from creditors, and then he saw it. A letter addressed to a Mr. Marks in Daviess County, Kentucky. Josiah's breath hitched as he read the chilling words, his eyes darting across the page, each sentence a hammer blow to his soul. The letter outlined Riley's true intentions. The move to Kentucky was not for a new beginning, but a strategic maneuver. The fertile lands of Kentucky were merely a temporary holding ground. The real plan was to sell off the majority of the enslaved people, including entire families, to the highest bidder in the bustling slave markets of the Deep South, using the proceeds to clear Riley's crushing debts. The promise of keeping families together was a cruel, calculated lie. The new life was a euphemism for dispersal, for the ultimate brutal separation. Josiah's hands trembled so violently he almost dropped the letter. The words swam before his eyes, each one a searing brand. He was not leading his people to freedom or even to a slightly better bondage. He was leading them to the slaughter, to the auction block, to a fate far worse than anything they had yet endured. He was to be the unwitting shepherd guiding his flock to the wolf. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He, Josiah Henson, the trusted overseer, the man who had made agonizing compromises to protect his family, was now an accomplice in the ultimate betrayal. He was to deliver his own people into the hands of their destroyers. The psychological torture was immediate and absolute. He had to maintain the facade of loyalty, to lead them with a convincing air of hope, all while knowing the horrific truth. His mind raced, a desperate scramble for a solution. Should he expose Riley, but how? And what would be the consequences? Riley's wrath would be swift and brutal, not just for him, but for Charlotte and their children, who would surely be sold first, and to the harshest master. Should he try to escape alone with his family? The thought was tempting, a siren song of self-preservation, but the faces of the others, their trusting eyes, flashed before him. He had led them. He had disciplined them. He had, in his own twisted way, protected them. Could he now abandon them to such a fate? The weight of this secret, this terrible knowledge, settled upon him like a shroud. He was trapped, caught between the devil of his master's deception and the deep blue sea of his own conscience. He had to plan an escape, not just for his family, but for as many as he could, while simultaneously playing the role of the loyal, hopeful leader. The journey to Kentucky, once a vague promise, now loomed as a treacherous path, each step fraught with peril, each mile a testament to his agonizing dilemma. The preparations for the journey, once filled with a false sense of hope among the enslaved, now felt like the meticulous arrangements for a mass sacrifice, with Josiah as the unwilling high priest. He watched the others pack their meager belongings, their faces alight with a fragile optimism. And the lie he had to live became a suffocating burden, a secret that threatened to consume him whole. The journey began in the late autumn of 1825, a procession of human misery and false hope snaking its way westward from Maryland. Josiah, astride a sturdy horse, led the caravan of wagons laden with meager possessions, and the long, shuffling line of enslaved men, women, and children, their faces etched with a mixture of weariness and a fragile, desperate optimism. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves and the distant promise of winter, but for Josiah, it was thick with the suffocating weight of his secret. He was their guide, their protector, their trusted leader, yet he knew he was leading them towards a precipice. The route was long and arduous, cutting through the rugged terrain of western Maryland, across the Allegheny Mountains, and into the rolling hills of Kentucky. Each day was a test of endurance, a relentless march under the watchful eye of Josiah, who had to maintain the illusion of control and purpose. He had to push them, to keep them moving, to ensure they reached their destination on schedule, all while his mind raced, desperately searching for a way to avert the impending disaster. The days blurred into a monotonous rhythm of travel. Dawn broke with the chill of the mountain air, the mist clinging to the trees like ghostly shrouds. Josiah would rouse the group, his voice firm but not unkind, urging them to break camp. The wagons creaked and groaned, the livestock lowed, and the shuffling feet of the enslaved people kicked up clouds of dust that coated everything in a fine, gritty film. They ate meager rations of cornmeal and salted pork, cooked over open fires, the smoke stinging their eyes. Nights were spent huddled together for warmth under the vast, indifferent canopy of stars, the sounds of the wilderness a constant, unsettling presence. Along the way they encountered other travelers, white settlers heading west, their faces filled with a similar, if less desperate, hope. Occasional groups of slave catchers, their eyes sharp and predatory, scrutinizing Josiah's papers with suspicion. And once, a small band of Native Americans, their silent, watchful presence, a stark reminder of another people dispossessed. Each encounter was a moment of heightened tension for Josiah, a near miss where his carefully constructed facade could crumble. He had to be vigilant, to answer questions with a practiced ease, to present himself as the loyal, efficient overseer, all while his heart hammered against his ribs. One incident in particular etched itself into Josiah's memory. They were deep in the mountains, the path narrow and treacherous, when a young woman named Ruth, exhausted and ill, collapsed. Her infant, a tiny wailing bundle, lay beside her. The group faltered, their progress halted. Josiah knew they couldn't afford delays. Riley's instructions had been clear. Maintain pace, avoid drawing attention. He also knew that leaving Ruth behind meant certain death or recapture. He looked at the faces of the others, their eyes pleading, their fear palpable. He thought of Charlotte, of his own children. He made a decision. He ordered 2 of the stronger men, Jacob and Daniel, not the same Daniel from the earlier incident but a younger, quieter man, to fashion a makeshift litter. He personally helped carry Ruth and her child, slowing their progress, risking Riley's wrath, but unable to abandon them. The act, though small, was a silent rebellion, a testament to the lingering humanity within him, a defiance of the cold logic of his master's orders. It earned him quiet gratitude from some, and a renewed, if fragile, trust from others. Yet the psychological torture of his secret never abated. He would watch the children play, their innocent laughter echoing through the valleys, and a wave of nausea would wash over him. He would listen to the adults discuss their hopes for Kentucky, their plans for a small garden, a slightly better cabin, and he would have to force a smile to offer words of encouragement, all while knowing the bitter truth. He felt like a ghost, moving among the living, privy to a horror they could not yet perceive. He often found himself staring into the flickering flames of the campfire at night, his mind replaying the words of Riley's letter, trying to find a loophole, a way out. He considered escaping with his family multiple times. He knew the routes, he had the skills. But each time, the faces of the others, their trusting eyes, held him back. He had led them this far. Could he truly abandon them to their fate? The burden of his perceived leadership, the responsibility he had reluctantly accepted, now bound him more tightly than any physical chain. He was leading them to their doom, and the knowledge was a constant, suffocating presence, a silent scream trapped within his chest. The journey, which stretched for weeks, became a crucible, forging Josiah's resolve even as it chipped away at his soul. He learned to lie with conviction, to project an aura of unwavering loyalty to Riley, even as he secretly plotted defiance. He learned to read the subtle signs of danger, to navigate the treacherous landscape of human suspicion. He was a man divided, a leader of a doomed procession, and the weight of that duality threatened to crush him with every passing mile. The arrival in Daviess County, Kentucky, was met with a mixture of exhaustion and cautious optimism. The new farm, though smaller and less established than Riley's Maryland estate, offered a temporary reprieve from the relentless journey. The enslaved people, weary but hopeful, began the arduous task of clearing land, building cabins, and planting crops, their spirits buoyed by the promise of a stable future. Josiah, however, saw only the grim reality behind the facade. The land was indeed fertile, but the master's absence, prolonged by his affairs in Maryland, was a glaring red flag. Riley had sent a local agent, a man named Mr. Finch, to oversee the initial operations. Finch was a cold, calculating man, his eyes devoid of warmth, his words clipped and precise. He treated Josiah with a grudging respect, acknowledging his efficiency. but there was an underlying current of suspicion in his demeanor. Josiah, ever vigilant, noticed the subtle signs. Finch's frequent hushed conversations with local traders, the way he would scrutinize the enslaved people with a detached, appraising gaze, as if calculating their market value. The evidence of betrayal began to mount, small, insidious clues that chipped away at the fragile hope of the others. The promised new tools never arrived. The quality of their rations, initially slightly better, quickly deteriorated. Most damningly, Finch began to conduct inspections of the enslaved people, lining them up, examining their teeth, their muscles, their overall health, much like a buyer would inspect livestock. He would make notes in a small, leather-bound ledger, his pen scratching ominously. Josiah, observing these chilling rituals, felt a cold dread spread through him. He knew what these inspections meant. He tried to find a way to confirm his fears, to gather irrefutable proof. One evening, feigning illness, he managed to slip into Finch's temporary office in the main cabin. His heart hammered against his ribs as he rummaged through the papers, his eyes scanning for anything that would confirm the letter he had read in Maryland. He found it. A series of correspondence between Finch and Riley, detailing the plan to sell off the excess stock, a chilling euphemism for human beings, to buyers in New Orleans and Natchez. The letters even contained a preliminary list of names, and Josiah's blood ran cold as he saw familiar names, names of families he had led across mountains and rivers, names of people who trusted him. His own family's names were not on the initial list, a small, terrifying mercy, but he knew it was only a matter of time. Riley's debts were deeper than he had imagined, and the sale of a few would not be enough. The knowledge was a suffocating weight. He was living a lie, leading his people to their doom, and the clock was ticking. He had to act. But how? A direct confrontation with Finch would be suicidal, leading to his immediate sale, and likely his family's. He had to maintain his facade, to continue playing the loyal overseer, even as his soul screamed in protest. The tension on the farm grew palpable. The enslaved people, though still largely unaware of the full extent of Riley's treachery, sensed the shift in the air. Their initial optimism began to curdle into unease. Whispers of the market and the South began to circulate, hushed and fearful. Josiah would catch their eyes, filled with unspoken questions, and he would have to force a reassuring smile, a lie that tasted like ash in his mouth. One afternoon, a small group of traders arrived, their faces hard, their eyes calculating. They spent hours with Finch, poring over the ledger, occasionally glancing towards the fields where the enslaved people toiled. Josiah watched from a distance, his muscles tensed, his mind racing. He saw Finch point towards a young mother, Abigail, and her two small children. Abigail, a gentle soul, had been among the most hopeful on the journey. Josiah felt a surge of protective fury, a desperate need to intervene, but he knew he couldn't. Not yet. He had to wait, to plan, to find the opportune moment. The master's arrival weeks later brought no relief. Riley was even more haggard, his forced cheerfulness now completely gone, replaced by a grim, desperate resolve. He immediately began to meet with Finch and the traders, their conversations held behind closed doors, their voices low and conspiratorial. Josiah, ever the trusted overseer, was often called in for minor tasks, allowing him to catch snippets of their discussions. He heard prices, dates, destinations. The sale was imminent. The moment Josiah realized he must choose was not a sudden revelation, but a slow, agonizing crystallization of dread. He saw the traders inspecting his own children, their small bodies measured, their health assessed. He saw Charlotte's terrified eyes, her silent plea. He knew then, with absolute certainty, that he could not save everyone. He could not fight the system, not alone. He could not expose Riley without condemning his own family to the very fate he sought to prevent. His choice, agonizing and soul-crushing, became clear. He had to prioritize his family's escape. He had to save Charlotte and their children, even if it meant leaving others behind to face the horrors of the auction block. The The moral weight of this decision was immense, a burden that would forever mark his soul, a secret he would carry to his grave. The accumulation of clues, the mounting evidence of betrayal, had led him to this breaking point, forcing him to make a choice no man should ever have to make. The breaking point arrived with the brutal finality of a gavel striking an auction block. It was a cold, grey morning in late autumn, the air thick with the promise of an early winter. Riley, his face a mask of grim determination, gathered the enslaved people in the main yard. His voice, usually booming, was now clipped and devoid of its usual false cheer. "I regret to inform you," he began, his eyes avoiding the faces before him, "that due to unforeseen circumstances, I must make some difficult decisions. Some of you will be moving on to new opportunities." The euphemism hung in the air, a cruel mockery of their hopes. Josiah watched, his heart a leaden weight in his chest, as the traders, the same men he had seen days earlier, stepped forward. They began to call out names. The first was Abigail, the young mother Josiah had seen them inspect. Her eyes, wide with terror, darted to her two small children, clinging to her skirts. A trader roughly separated them, pulling Abigail towards a waiting wagon, her children screaming, reaching out for her. The sound of their cries, raw and primal, tore through the yard, a sound that would haunt Josiah's nightmares for years to come. Then came the name of Jacob, the strong young man who had helped carry Ruth on the journey. He was torn from his wife Esther, who collapsed to the ground, her silent sobs shaking her entire body. One by one, families were shattered, lives irrevocably broken. The air was filled with the sounds of weeping, of desperate pleas, of the chilling indifference of the traders. Josiah stood among them, his face impassive, his body rigid. He was the overseer, the trusted man. He had to maintain the illusion, but inside, a storm raged. He saw the faces of those he had led, their eyes now filled with a crushing despair, some turning to him, their silent questions a searing indictment. He saw the horror in Charlotte's eyes, her hand instinctively reaching for their children, pulling them closer. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that his family would be next. Riley's debts were too vast, his desperation too profound. The sight of Abigail's children, their small hands reaching for their mother as she was dragged away, was the final agonizing catalyst. It was a mirror reflecting his own deepest fear. He could not, would not, allow that to happen to Charlotte and their children. The choice, once a theoretical torment, was now a stark, brutal reality. He would save his family, he would escape, and he would do it tonight. The decision, once made, brought with it a grim, cold clarity. He moved with a newfound purpose, his mind racing, meticulously planning every detail. He had observed the layout of the farm, the routines of the few remaining white overseers, the paths through the surrounding wilderness. He knew the moon cycle, the direction of the North Star. He sought out Charlotte, his eyes conveying the urgency of his message without words. In the privacy of their cabin, he whispered his plan, his voice low and steady, masking the tremor in his heart. Charlotte, her face pale but resolute, nodded. She understood the stakes. They would take their 6 children, leaving behind everything they owned, everything they knew, to plunge into the terrifying unknown. They spent the day in a blur of forced normalcy, their movements precise, their faces carefully neutral. Josiah gathered what little food he could discreetly acquire, a small sack of cornmeal, some dried meat, a few hard biscuits. Charlotte sewed small pouches for the children to carry their meager belongings, a few precious trinkets, a worn blanket. They spoke in hushed tones. Their children, sensing the gravity of the situation, remained unusually quiet, their wide eyes watching their parents with a mixture of fear and trust. As dusk settled, casting long, eerie shadows across the farm, the sounds of weeping from the separated families still echoed faintly in the distance, a haunting reminder of the fate they were desperately trying to escape. Josiah waited until the last embers of the overseer's fire had died down, until the sounds of the farm had settled into the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. The night was moonless, cloaked in a thick, oppressive darkness that was both a blessing and a curse. Josiah led his family out of their cabin, each step agonizingly slow, each rustle of leaves beneath their feet sounding like a thunderclap. He carried the youngest child, Sarah, in his arms, her small body a warm, fragile weight against his chest. Charlotte held Mary's hand, guiding the other children, their small figures barely visible in the gloom. They moved like phantoms, skirting the edge of the fields, their bare feet silent on the damp earth. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking danger. Every distant dog bark sent a jolt of terror through Josiah's veins. He remembered the stories of slave catchers, their bloodhounds, their relentless pursuit. He remembered the fear of recapture, the brutal punishments that awaited those who dared to seek freedom. As they neared the edge of the woods, a twig snapped loudly behind them. Josiah froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He spun around, his eyes straining into the darkness, his hand instinctively reaching for the small, crude knife he had hidden in his belt. Nothing, only the rustling of leaves in the wind. A false alarm, but a stark reminder of the constant peril. They plunged into the dense woods, the trees closing around them like a protective yet menacing embrace. The darkness here was absolute, broken only by the faint, shimmering light of the distant stars filtering through the canopy. Josiah relied on his intimate knowledge of the wilderness, his senses heightened, guiding them by the feel of the terrain, the subtle shift in the wind, the faint scent of pine. The children, though tired and frightened, moved with remarkable quietness, their small hands clinging to their parents, their trust absolute. Charlotte, her face a pale blur in the darkness, moved with a quiet determination, her eyes fixed on Josiah, a silent pillar of strength. As they put more distance between themselves and the farm, the sounds of human misery faded, replaced by the symphony of the night forest. But the silence was not peaceful. It was pregnant with the unspoken fears, the desperate hopes, and the crushing weight of the choices Josiah had made. He was leading his family towards an uncertain freedom, leaving behind a community he had, in his own way, betrayed. The night of their escape was not just a flight from bondage. It was a flight from the moral wreckage of his past, a desperate scramble for survival that would forever be tinged with the bitter taste of guilt. The escape itself was a blur of primal fear and desperate endurance. For weeks, Josiah and his family moved under the cloak of darkness, guided by the North Star and the faint whispered directions passed along the clandestine network of the Underground Railroad. They traveled through dense forests, across icy rivers, and over treacherous mountains, their bodies aching, their stomachs gnawing with hunger, their spirits sustained only by the fierce, unyielding hope for freedom. Each rustle in the leaves, each distant dog bark, each shadow that danced in the moonlight sent a jolt of terror through Josiah's veins. He carried the youngest children when their small legs gave out, his powerful frame straining under the weight, his mind a constant whirlwind of vigilance and prayer. Charlotte, a silent pillar of strength, kept the older children moving, her eyes fixed on Josiah, her faith in him unwavering. As they journeyed northward, the faces of those left behind in Kentucky haunted Josiah's waking hours and invaded his restless sleep. He saw Abigail's screaming children, their small hands reaching for their mother. He saw Esther's broken face as Jacob was dragged away. He saw Daniel's accusing eyes, the silent question of his betrayal. The weight of their suffering, the knowledge of the fate he had condemned them to, pressed down on him. A suffocating burden that even the crisp, free air of the North could not alleviate. He had saved his family, yes, but at what cost to his soul? Was he a hero for securing their freedom, or a coward for abandoning his brethren? The question gnawed at him, a relentless torment. Finally, after weeks of harrowing travel, they crossed the border into Canada. The moment was not one of triumphant celebration, but of profound, exhausted relief, tinged with a deep, pervasive sorrow. The air felt different, lighter, yet the psychological chains of his past remained. They were free, yes, but the scars of bondage and the deeper wounds of his moral compromises were etched into his very being. In Canada, Josiah and his family began the arduous task of building a new life. He worked tirelessly, clearing land, building a cabin, establishing a community for other fugitives. He became a respected leader, a beacon of hope for those who followed the same perilous path to freedom. But even amidst his tireless work and the burgeoning community, the ghosts of Kentucky lingered. Years later, a chance encounter brought a chilling confirmation of his deepest fears. A newly arrived fugitive, a man named Caleb, not the same Caleb from the Maryland incident, but a younger man who had been on the Kentucky farm, recognized Josiah. Their reunion was brief, fraught with unspoken tension. Caleb, his eyes hollow, recounted the horrors that followed Josiah's escape. Riley, enraged by Josiah's perceived betrayal, had indeed sold off the remaining enslaved people, including many of the families Josiah had led from Maryland to the brutal markets of the Deep South. Abigail's children had been sold separately. Esther, broken by Jacob's sale, had succumbed to despair. The news was a confirmation of Josiah's worst nightmares, a brutal validation of his agonizing choice, and a fresh wave of guilt washed over him, threatening to drown him in its depths. He had saved his own, but at the expense of so many others. The moral complexity of his actions was not diminished by his family's freedom. It was amplified, a constant nagging question that would forever define his legacy. Josiah Henson's life in Canada became a testament to resilience and an unwavering commitment to helping others find the freedom he had so desperately sought. He established the Dawn Settlement, a thriving community for fugitive slaves in Dresden, Ontario, where he worked tirelessly to provide education, vocational training, and a safe haven for those escaping the brutal realities of American slavery. He traveled extensively, speaking out against the injustices of bondage, his powerful voice echoing in abolitionist circles across North America and even in England. He became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, personally guiding scores of men, women, and children to freedom. His intimate knowledge of the escape routes and his unwavering courage, making him a legendary figure among the enslaved. In 1849, at the urging of abolitionist friends, Josiah dictated his autobiography, The Life of Josiah Henson, formerly a slave, now an inhabitant of Canada, as narrated by himself. It was a powerful, moving account of his journey from bondage to freedom, a testament to the human spirit's capacity for endurance. However, as he recounted his story, Josiah made a conscious, agonizing decision. He sanitized certain parts, carefully omitting the darkest, most morally ambiguous chapters of his life. He spoke of his role as an overseer, but he downplayed the brutal necessities of the position, the times he had wielded the whip, the silent accusations in the eyes of his brethren. He spoke of the journey to Kentucky, but he omitted the chilling discovery of Riley's true intentions, the secret knowledge of betrayal he carried, and the agonizing choice to prioritize his family's escape over warning the others. He presented a narrative of suffering and eventual triumph, a story designed to inspire, to garner sympathy for the abolitionist cause, and perhaps to protect himself from the searing guilt that still gnawed at his soul. He crafted a version of himself that was palatable, heroic, and uncomplicated, a version that could serve as a symbol for a greater cause. It was this sanitized narrative that eventually found its way into the hands of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Deeply moved by Henson's account, particularly his journey to Kentucky and his eventual escape, Stowe used his life as a primary inspiration for her seminal anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852. She transformed Josiah Henson, the complex, morally tormented man, into the fictional character of Uncle Tom, a figure of unwavering piety, passive endurance, and ultimate martyrdom. The irony was profound, and for Josiah, deeply unsettling. A man who had wielded the whip, who had made impossible choices, who had carried the crushing burden of a terrible secret, was now remembered as the gentle, submissive Uncle Tom. The public embraced this simplified, idealized version, a symbol of Christian suffering that resonated deeply with the moral sensibilities of the time. But the real Josiah Henson, the man who lived with the ghosts of Kentucky, the man who knew the bitter taste of compromise, remained largely unknown. His true story buried beneath layers of literary interpretation and historical convenience. Even in his later years, as he continued his work and received accolades for his contributions to the abolitionist movement, the shadow of his past never fully lifted. He carried the weight of his choices, the silent screams of those he had left behind, the knowledge of the darker truths he had never fully revealed. Perhaps in his private moments, in the quiet solitude of his cabin, he revisited those agonizing decisions, those moments when he had to choose between his family's survival and the fate of others. Perhaps he wondered if he could have done more, if there was another path he could have taken. While no definitive smoking gun documents explicitly detailing Josiah's internal torment or his full knowledge of Riley's betrayal have surfaced, the historical record offers tantalizing hints. The stark contrast between his public narrative and the brutal realities of the overseer's role, the documented financial desperation of Isaac Riley, and the known practices of selling enslaved people from Maryland to the Deep South, all suggest a far more complex and morally fraught existence than the one presented in his autobiography. The very act of sanitizing his story, a common practice among former slaves seeking to present a heroic narrative for the abolitionist cause, speaks volumes about the unspoken burdens they carried. Josiah Henson was not merely a victim. He was a survivor who made impossible choices in an impossible system. A man whose true legacy lies not in the simplified image of Uncle Tom, but in the chilling, unexamined depths of his moral courage and his enduring secret guilt. If Josiah Henson's harrowing journey and the unsettling moral complexities of his life have left you questioning the narratives we often take for granted, then you're exactly where you need to be. Don't forget to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. What are your thoughts on the impossible choices Josiah faced? Do you see him as a hero, a survivor, or something far more ambiguous? Share your insights in the comments below, and let's continue to unravel the unsettling truths that lie beneath the surface of our past.